Hello everyone, and welcome to this research seminar hosted by the British Centre for Literary Translation at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, England. My name is Duncan Large and I'm the BCLT's Executive Director. You'll be aware that this event is being recorded and we'll be adding the recording to our YouTube channel shortly. As ever, I'm grateful to my BCLT colleague Anna Good for her technical assistance. Now, for the last 3 years, we've been running a program of translators in residence that brings 2 translators to BCLT each spring, working on their own translation projects and interacting with our students. One of the things we ask our translators in residence to do is share their work with us in a research seminar. And I'm delighted to say that the remaining 2 seminars in this year's BCLT online research seminar series are being hosted by our 2 current translators in residence. In 2 weeks' time, we'll be hearing from Nariman Youssef on the subject of speaking in many tongues, multilingualism as an aesthetic. But today we're hearing from our other resident translator, Kari Dickson. Kari is a translator who specializes in translating works of Norwegian literature into English. She has a BA in Scandinavian Studies from University College London and an MA in translation from the University of Surrey. Her portfolio includes literary fiction, crime, non-fiction, and plays, especially the work of Rune Christiansen, Thomas Enger, Erika Fatland, Karin Fossum, and Gunhild Øyehaug. Her translation of Roslund and Hellström's 3 Seconds won the CWA International Dagger in 2011, and her translation of the children's book Brown by Ovriås and Torseter won the American Library Association's Mildred L. Batchelder Award in 2020. Kari teaches Norwegian language, literature and translation in the Scandinavian Studies Department at the University of Edinburgh. She's a former workshop leader at the BCLT Summer School and is currently translator in residence at BCLT. Her project is called Playing Translation, using improvisation and music to explore the sound of a language and the rhythm, melody and mood of an original text and translation. We'll be hearing rather more about her current BCLT project in her presentation today. Just before I hand over to Kari, let me say that after her talk, we'll have time for a Q&A session, question and answer. We're using the Zoom webinar platform, and that allows you, our audience, to submit questions via the Q&A button. So that function is available from the start. Please do use it when questions strike you. Do feel free to submit your questions then at any time, and I'll put them to Kari on your behalf at the end. We also have the chat function available, and I can see that it's already in use. So do feel free to let us know where you're joining us from and your reactions in the course of the presentation. But if you have specific questions for Kari, please do put them in the Q&A. That's enough from me. For now, it's my great pleasure to hand over to Kari. And Kari's talk is titled Active Listening, Music and Translation. Kari, welcome.
Thank you. I am slightly challenged technically, for those of you who know me, so bear with me if anything goes awry. We think we've got it sorted. So thank you very much, Duncan. And I would like to start by thanking the BCLT for giving me this opportunity. Just to say that I'm reading from a text that's beside my computer. So obviously I can't see you. So if I'm looking to the side, that's why. The residency has allowed me the space that I've been longing for to think beyond the practicalities and technicalities of day-to-day translation, and to play with my thoughts in new angles. As a freelancer, time and money really allow me that luxury. I would also like to point out that I come with no findings. So if that's what you were expecting or hoping for, you might want to slip out quietly now. But what I do offer is lots of questions, trains of thought, and I would welcome any questions and input. If you have any suggestions or knowledge that might benefit me and add to my inquiry, I'd be really grateful to hear from you. It's a long time since I've attempted any substantial research. In fact, it's probably decades. And I realize that I'm woefully lacking in my knowledge of linguistics, and my limited translation theory is also pretty rusty by now. I do feel like I'm a bit like I'm sitting here wearing the emperor's new clothes, but even if just one of you goes away with a new thought, I'll be happy. And I hope that by doing this, I can get better at doing this. As you may know, I'm sharing my residency with Nariman Youssef, and we meet once a week to chat, exchange ideas about our projects, and share our progress. And we've been surprised time and again by how similar our exploration is, despite coming from very different starting points. I want to start this work in progress presentation by sharing a quote that she gave me. It's from an essay, Rast, by Yasmini Haj, published in the book River in an Ocean, Essays on Translation. Could I have slide 1, Duncan? Thank you. A human's first task is to translate. As infants, we breathe air and immediately translate. To survive, we translate. In different tones, infants articulate hunger, distress, and fatigue. In turn, their caregivers experiment, juggle interpretations, understand, translate. Translation becomes a mutual undertaking, a habit both receivers develop, and an art both ends finesse. A first translation act can only be musical. A sense of security cannot be offered in words. Hunger cannot be satisfied with idioms. Vocal rhythms and visible actions are what an infant needs, what they demand in equal vocal rhythm and action. A first translation act cannot be set in cannot be in sets of vocal molds. It must be improvised. It must be experiment. It must exteriorize to prepare reception. The order of the sound doesn't matter in a first translation. And in a sense, every act of translation should strive to be a first. It should try and eliminate words, pre-made maquettes, and leave nothing but music. Thank you, Duncan. The idea of running a translation workshop using improvised music to explore what happens to the rhythm and music in the transfer from source language to translation came to me about 6 years ago. It was in part inspired by the kind of Chinese whisper structure that Adam Thirlwell used in Multiples, the idea of layering, to see what happened to style and story when translated through a sequence of multiple languages. But also a birdsong workshop, a poetry and music performance, and the fact that we always talk about good writing in terms of music and rhythm. I had some initial conversations with an old school friend, Dr. Hafter Medbo, who is a jazz guitarist and now head of music at Napier University in Edinburgh. He was excited by the idea as well and thought it had potential. We were about to put in for funding when COVID hit, and so it was put on the shelf for another 4 years until now. The reason that I contacted Hafter was that I had watched how in various gigs they built up pieces of music by looping rhythms, riffs, sounds, and layering them. And I thought that if you recorded a piece from the source text, you could then layer it with a recording of the same piece in translation to identify similarities in rhythm and music between the two. And that this might also be a way of demonstrating to others who are not directly involved in translation themselves what we mean when we talk about the rhythm and music of a text, that it could perhaps be a kind of performance as well. I'm using the residency to explore this further. Hafter and I will be running a workshop on the 15th of May, and while I'm clear about the content of the workshop, I am, as mentioned, far from having a clear methodology and solid knowledge base with which to quantify any findings. So what I'm going to talk about today is my journey so far, my questions, thoughts, reading, and where this has led me. To be honest, I think it might take at least a year or two before I'm able to properly do what I'd like to do. And in the meantime, I'm very much enjoying the exploring. And I hope that you'll enjoy the journey too, even if it is somewhat shapeless at present and abstract. My current terrain, how we as translators, practitioners, I'll say that again. My current terrain is how we as translation practitioners listen to what we read, to the text and what we hear. Before I take you there, let me give you the lay of the land, which is back to the starting point and me and where I come from. Because one of the things that I'm discovering is that no matter how hard we might try to level the field and to strive for transparency, translation, the act of translation and the business of translation is by its very nature subjective. How we as translators see, hear and move in the world has a profound influence on our practice. What we like, what we talk about, who we meet, what they like, where there is resonance, there can be magic. I grew up in Edinburgh with an English father and a Norwegian mother. My grandparents couldn't speak English, so I grew up speaking Norwegian as we went there every summer. For me, Norwegian is a heritage language and also very much an oral language. I have grown up with the sounds, rhythms, intonations in me and have always carried them with me, along with an increasing amount of lexical and grammatical luggage. When I read Norwegian, I hear a very clear Norwegian voice and melody and don't just read the words. It's really only now that I'm beginning to understand how important this oral aspect is to my translation. And why my interest in this particular novel is why I'm so interested in what happens between text and sound. It wasn't until I first studied Norwegian at university and then even later became a teacher that I learned more about the structure and technicalities of the language, which have informed more specifically how I deconstruct Norwegian and rebuild it in translation. I only write Norwegian in correspondence or when I'm teaching. So while I'm bilingual in spoken Norwegian, I don't inhabit the language fully, which allows me an outside perspective. And I kind of hope that makes sense. I'm sure that many of you will recognize the experience of being a slightly different person depending on which language you're speaking, because of the rhythms, the conventions, and the culture, and the joys and inherent loneliness of bilingualism and multilingualism, so beautifully expressed in a poem by Agnes Turok called Love or Death by Bilingualism, where she writes, "Because they will never know all the conjugations of you." On Ceci Rossi's advice, I read Peter Elbow's essay, "What Do We Mean When We Talk About Voice in Texts?" which is a hugely interesting and engaging essay, and his style really resonated with me. This particular little paragraph chimed with my current preoccupation. Could I have slide 2? Thank you, Duncan. We can distinguish 2 dimensions to someone's voice: the sound of their voice and the manner or style in which they speak. The first is the quality of noise they make based as it were on the physical instrument that they are playing, our bodies. And the second is the kind of tunes, rhythms and styles that they play on their instrument. Thank you. And just as our voice depends on our particular physical instrument, so does our hearing, as we're all put together slightly differently, which I'm learning about in This Is Your Brain on Music by Daniel Levitine. Add to that the lived experience of a language and everything else that life brings along, and you'll see what I mean by subjectivity. I'm now going to move along to my first stop, which is rather surprisingly arrival. Could I have screen 3, please, Duncan? So in 2016, the Masters section in the Masters in Translation Department at Edinburgh University ran a series of events looking at translation in film. And I was asked to give a brief introduction or provocation for the post-showing discussion on the sci-fi film Arrival, which had just come out. It's about aliens landing on Earth and a big black obelisk, which you can see there, and a translator is employed to try and communicate with them. At the time, I had just finished translating a speech by the Norwegian travel writer Erika Fatland. She generally travels alone, as she feels that this is when she is truly able to meet people and hear their stories. However, when she was traveling in China, despite her best efforts to learn Mandarin, she was, to quote, rendered illiterate and mute because she could not speak or read any of the languages there. So she goes on to say, could I have slide 4, please? As a species, language is our greatest advantage and is the only real means of cross-border communication that we have. But sometimes it can also be the greatest barrier. It is only through language that we can get to know the others. Thank you. I'm not sure that I entirely agree with her, but I was thinking a lot about the will to communicate and to feel connection. And it struck me as rather odd that in the film, the first way the translator tries to communicate with the aliens is through written English, when there are so many other means, including music. In fact, it's amazing how far we can get without words when there is a will to communicate. And I'm sure you all have the experience of that kind of situation. And this will to communicate is often what lies behind the desire to learn languages, the desire to communicate, to connect, and to learn about new worlds and outlooks. It's an active choice. And in today's world, I would also say it's a political choice. Which takes us to the next port of call, hearing and listening. Those of us who are fortunate enough to hear are hearing all the time. The creak of the chairs as we shift position, me talking, the traffic outside, the birds, the hum of the fridge, even silence, which has a sound. But listening is a conscious act. It's active. It requires attention, focus. It requires stilling and filtering out other noises that might distract us. And I would say that, again, it's driven by a desire to connect and or communicate. Often we embark on the act of listening, knowing what we want to hear, whether that's conscious or not. In terms of speech or reading, listening takes us beyond the words, to read between the lines and to hear what's not said. And so to listen for rhythm and to listen for the rhythm, the music, the sounds and style that underpin these, which is as important as the words because it gives resonance. It touches something in us that allows us to understand, hopefully, and it opens us. When I listen to people, it's because I want to connect with them. Sadly, I'm not a musician, so when I listen to music, more often than not, it's because I want to connect with something in me to give space to something that I cannot put into words. Unless, of course, I'm just enjoying dancing with someone or belting out lyrics. But that, again, is about connection. Hearing is something that we are born with or not, or that we lose. But listening is a skill. It's an art that we consciously have to work on. And as translators, that is what we do and what we have to do. We listen to the text. In the introduction to Translating the Perceptions of Text, Clive Scott discusses this in response to an article in The Observer, the New Review, where Maureen Freely says, "What I want to do most is capture the music of Orhan Pamuk's language as I hear it." So this is the quote. What is it to capture the music, voice, rhythm of the original author? The enumerated features are all things one hears, one gives auditory body to, through the silent text. One might argue that they are linguistically present in a certain configuration of phonemes or syntactical structures or word choices or lengths of phrase, but that would only be to tell half the story. All these features can be visually identified, but experienced only in voice, a voice which comes to supply other features crucial to music. Voice and rhythm, the so-called paralinguistics features such as intonation, timbre, pausing, tone, speed of delivery, relative strengths of stress. And that voice is not the voice of the author unless he or she has made a recording and that a recording is felt to be an entirely adequate performance of the text. The voice is rather the voice of the reader. One hears oneself reading. One hears one's own voice taking possession of the text. Thank you. And while I guess I've always known this, seeing it there on the page did give me a jolt of surprise. How we listen and what we hear is based on our lifetime's experience. A slight but charming digression, but still about how we hear what we read. In Kate Briggs's This Little Art, she gives a lovely example, which crops up in a book that she's reading to her children. Without knowing what it actually sounds like, because it's presented in a kind of Gothic font, the reader knows that Dragonese sounds different. And an aside to that, another line of thought that I want to pursue at some point is how the physical presentation of text, the font, the layout, even the paper, influence our expectations of what we're about to read and how we then listen and hear. But that's a journey for another time. Back to rhythm and music. Our reading will be subjective. It has to be, but there are some more objective elements that will inform our perception of rhythm and music in the text, such as isochrony. This is a relatively new concept for me, so I only have a very superficial understanding, again, thanks to the time that I've been given on this residency. But it has given me a key to go forwards with when looking at the transfer of rhythm. Both my languages of habitual use are stress-timed languages, which makes it easier, I'm sure. That means, as I understand it, that the rhythm of the language is driven by stress at relatively regular intervals, and the sounds in between are extended or contracted as necessary to fit the stress. French, Italian, and Spanish, among others, are syllable-timed, which means that each syllable is given equal duration. This was an aha moment for me when it comes to the rat-a-tat-tat delivery of Iberian Spanish. And here I set off on a detour. The rat-a-tat-tat of Spanish made me think of the stereotypes we have of various languages. Portuguese, ush, bush, bush. French, ho-he, ho-he, ho. Scandinavian, the Muppets, birdie, 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 birdie. And I was reminded of a nonsense verse that my uncle used to teach in nursery school in Norway to help children with vocalization and pronunciation. But it was also fun. And I'll do that now. Akke bakke bonneke rakke edla medlem yong shong tong toodlabong issa bissa ba boff. So as you can hear, it's got a very strong rhythm and it enunciates nouns such as akke bakke bonneke rakke. E's on the ends of words are important in Norwegian, but also some of the more complex sounds like sh and sh. And I thought, wouldn't it be great to do something like that in a workshop, to create a nonsense rhyme in English? But then I thought, what does English sound like from the outside? I have no idea. Perhaps because I've never studied it or taught English, I've never questioned my ability to write English. What are the dominant vowels? How prevalent are sibilants? So I went off and Googled and I asked some non-native friends in Edinburgh, and they tended to say that it sounded like sheep, bah, or hens. So I don't know if you agree with that. I found some very amusing videos of what English sounds like to foreigners, which are mainly American English, which has to be said. And I'm going to try and challenge myself to share a video now. I have to go out and into my screen. If it doesn't work, Anna is going to put them into the chat so that you can listen to them later. So let's try. So the first video is a video by an Italian, there you can see my whole screen, by an Italian singer from the 1970s. And he was trying to prove that Italians would like anything that was in English. So the song is actually gibberish. There are only 2 words in it that are actually English, which are all right. So I think that gives you an idea of how English sounds to other people, and I find it very amusing. It's also quite a good tune, and I have Nikki Smiley to thank for that regen. In the way that there is corpus for words, I thought that there might be something similar for sounds, for the shape of the language, for want of a better word. But so far, I have found nothing. And if any of you know of anything, please let me know. My idea then was to record people speaking British English in various dialects and to layer the recordings and then to mash, my word, so that the words became indistinct, so you could pick out dominant sounds. Surely there was a software that could do that. I'm stymied. I haven't found it yet. I've spoken to a couple of sound engineers, and while they find the idea really exciting, no one knows quite how to do it. And I've also been introduced to a speech analysis program called Pratt, which has been developed by a couple of Dutch linguists. But as yet, I don't know if it can do what I want. And I'm going to read you this. I just got a text from one of my Pratt contacts. And this will give you an idea of how much I have to learn. If you're interested in the musicality, then you can use Pratt to measure the pitch contour of your recordings. That will give you a measurement in megahertz per frame, usually about 10, of speech. You could see which language have more variance over the recording, for instance. Rhythm is a bit trickier, but you'd need to know exactly how long each phoneme or syllable is. And for that, you'd need to align the transcription with the recording. That would involve some fancier algorithms, but it is doable if you're not afraid of a bit of coding. Oops, I have a lot to learn. So it's a steep path to a valley I need to return to. And given the time limit of the residency and the date for the workshop, it will be something I do afterwards. But I mean to continue this. In the meantime, for the workshop, I'm going to use an extract from the Gruffalo in English, Scots, Norwegian, and Spanish to see how the translators have dealt with the heavy rhythm and rhyme. I got a Spanish friend to read me the Spanish version the other day, and what was interesting was that I could hear no coherent rhyme or rhythm. But as I have no understanding of the words or know nothing about the inherent rhymes, prosody, shape, and style available in the language, I'm in no position to say if and how the translation replicates those in the English or not, which is why I need to develop a methodology, and which is why doing in a workshop with people who understand Spanish in this instance is the best way to go about it. In one of the papers that I'm reading at the moment by someone called Elle van Handel, which I haven't finished yet, on the rhythm and language of, on the rhythm of music and musical rhythm, which is specifically focuses on the linguistic concept of stress timing versus syllable timing in language and the degree to which the rhythmic characteristics of spoken languages in the two categories are reflected in 19th century instrumental music. That was quite a mouthful. It says that numerous perceptual studies have shown that infants are able to differentiate between sentences in their native languages and sentences from a language belonging to another rhythmic class, but not between two languages from the same rhythmic class, which I find incredible. However, it doesn't say anything about how these studies were carried out. This made me think of Teletubbies. Andy Davenport, one of the creators, studied speech sciences at UCL when I was there. And I know that he created the Teletubbies language based on language acquisition in children. When talking about the Teletubbies' controversial language in an interview in The Independent in 1997, he said about a particular episode, "The sequence was about rhythm, which is essential for children's language learning." Music is often used as a means to interpret and illustrate phenomena in other disciplines. As part of my research, I've watched a couple of videos that I can highly recommend. One is a TED Talk by Wanda Diaz-Merced, a blind astronomer who has found a way to sonify large data sets into audible sound, allowing us to hear the stars. The other is a project by Milton Mericades, another jazz guitarist and composer, who fed sleep data through his computer to compose music so that blind people could hear their sleep patterns. As I mentioned at the start, I thought that improvisation could be a neat, pleasing, and entertaining way to demonstrate and compare rhythm between the original and translation or translations. And through recording and looping, attempt to find how we mirror rhythm and musicality. Is it mirrored or transposed into a new language universe? I'm just going to show another wee clip here of a musician who has transcribed and harmonized music and speech. So bear with me a little moment when I find it. Here we go. Ooh, so there you go. A lot of fun can be had with speech and music. When I read some of what Haftor has written about improvisation, and in particular his most recent recording, which were live free improvisation, I am struck by the words used to describe the process. Empathy, attunement, mirroring, harmonize, for example, all words that can be applied to translation, and all of which are what I have called active listening. We listen with empathy. We tune in our auditory faculties and inner ear so that we can capture what it is we want to hear that will enable us to mirror and harmonize. We follow the contours of someone else's rhythm. Sometimes this is easy, and sometimes it comes naturally. Other times, I have to work really hard to move beyond the words. I know that lots of translators read their work out loud to themselves, and I'm one of them, particularly when I'm fighting to move beyond simply the words. The next wee piece that I'm going to show you is something that I struggled with recently because of a lexical issue. Overall, I felt quite aligned with the author's style, and I slipped into what I heard as the voice describing experiences from the far north of Norway, which I recognize because I've been there, because I've experienced a lot of what she was talking about. And I'm claiming because we shared an aesthetic, a language, a music, even when it became two languages. And then there was this damned word. Could I have the next slide, please? So the word is Spillhaugen, which is the name, as you can see in the translation, the name of the farm where she grew up. And because of the way the rest of the sentence continued, I had to find a way to work with Spillhaugen. And I came up with playmound. One of the problems is that in Norwegian, there are lots of words that can mean multiple things, and you will know from the context what they mean. Sometimes they're nouns, sometimes they're verbs, sometimes they can have 2 or 3 meanings. And in English, we then have to choose which of the meanings it applies in this case. So the word spill can mean game. The verb spilla can mean to play, and it can mean to play a game, it can mean to play music, it can mean to play a role. So there's lots of things that are packed into that one word. And I played around with game hill, play hill, game mound, play mound. And play mound, for me, was audibly most satisfying. It had the best rhythm. And even though it doesn't directly reflect the rhythm of Spillhaugen, it has 2 syllables rather than 3, for example. They're none of the same vowels really either. To me, it was pleasing. But then I had to think about carrying on. So I said, or game mound, that is. And as you can see, she uses spille som I årfuglens vårspill. So she's playing on spill. Game, in this case, the game. And the vårspill, which I spoke to her about, is the mating game. But then I thought, you're getting game. And the point is not the repetition of the word. The point is how the word is played on. So game as in the Black Grouse's spring cavortings, which are playful, a play of life, full of hope, as it is, as in what is to be lived. Sorry, that was a very badly enunciated. But I hope you see there where I was really trying to think, what is the rhythm? How is the progression of this sentence when I have to put something in that's going to disrupt it? And how can I make that meaningful and have a sound that is pleasing? And you may or may not agree with what I ended up with in the translation, but that's neither here nor there at this point. Thank you, Duncan. Haftar and I have a lot in common. So this idea of shared aesthetics. We both have Scandinavian roots. We both grew up in Scotland, and we even went to the same school. So I could probably give Haftar this piece of writing about a place called Hudsaløya in the far north of Norway, and the music he would produce or improvise, I'm guessing, would at least resonate, perhaps echo, what I feel when I read it. Which is another reason why it was natural to ask him if he was interested in doing a workshop with me. There's a slight danger there that we could just become an echo chamber, but I think that we're both listening. We both really want to know what the outcome is. I had originally imagined this as a bilingual workshop with Norwegian and English, so we could look in more detail at examples like the one I just showed you. Another exercise I think would be interesting is to ask the participants to stick as closely as possible to the source language rhythm at the cost of meaning where necessary. But obviously that's not possible in the same way in a multilingual workshop. So instead, we can take a language that is not represented in that group, hear it read, have it played, and then discuss what we hear and what clues and information the rhythm and tone might give us about the content. I'm fascinated by what happens in this space, this listening between the author and the translator, the original and the translation, between one musician and another. And when I watch music, I'm as interested in watching the musicians playing to each other and with each other and how they communicate while they're playing as I am in listening to the music. I'm going to start wrapping up now with a quote by Benjamin Bagley, taken from Haftar's work on improvisation, that applies to both what we're going to do and what we do as translators in relation to the text and author. Could I have the last slide? Thank you. An improvisation partnership is a type of ongoing relationship grounded in the partner's mutual recognition of one another as sharing an end with a respect given to a given activity. So, thank you. Where next? I find myself at a holding station. What do we listen to when we read, and what do we hear? I can't answer that question with any certainty. Only this morning, I found myself wondering if, when reading with translation in mind, we're already starting to read in two languages, much like a simultaneous interpreter. I have learned how little I know and how much I need to learn to be able to explore this further in any meaningful way. And I hope that by running the workshop, I will get some more pointers. What I thought would be a simple and fun idea has opened up a far wider reach than I had anticipated. So I'm off to learn more about isochrony, prosody, linguistics, and software. And there are other places I'd like to visit too. At the interview for the translator residency, I was asked if I could foresee any challenges, and my answer was a resounding yes, the biggest thing being arms and legs. That this idea would lead to others, like a constant dot-to-dot of discovery, and it has. Through my conversations with Nari, who is giving her research, as Duncan mentioned, on the 8th of May, through our conversations about translating both ways, about written and oral competencies, I have decided to do a little experiment. I want to try translating a short story, say, into Norwegian orally. not because I want to start translating into Norwegian, but to see if I'm freer in my expression and manage to capture the tone, rhythm, and style better, if indeed it's more Norwegian than when I'm stiffened and fretting about writing. Because Norwegian is predominantly an oral language for me. And then to translate something else in writing and give the two pieces to a Norwegian translator or other literary person to look at and compare out of pure curiosity. Peter Elbow also suggests that a fruitful area of research might be, what are the features of text that many readers find audible? How much agreement do we get about the audibility of text, and among what kind of readers? Audiobooks is another area that I'd like to explore, with several roads leading in and out from that. For example, what are the differences in experience when reading and listening to a book? And how do audiobooks fit in with the centuries-old oral tradition? My London Book Fair experience this year involved a lot of talk about audiobooks. One Norwegian publisher mentioned that there are now authors who have started to write primarily for audiobooks. And if that's a growing trend, how might the translation of audiobooks change, and how much more akin might they be to theatre translation? The general feeling amongst those I talk to is that genre fiction, or books where the story is more important than the style, are better suited to audio. Apparently, if the writing is highly stylized or there are too many shifts in time, it becomes harder to follow when listening. And then there is the big question of what happens as a result of AI. One possible trajectory is that there will be an increasing split in the literary market, the book market, and the AI will be used more for genre fiction and less, if at all, for literary fiction. And I'm going to end on a positive note here, because AI can't listen. It can't do what we do. Thank you.
Thank you, Kari. Wow, what a fabulous presentation. It's so rich and so thought-provoking. A lot of love in the chat for your video examples.
Yay! Good.
And some very, I mean, by all means, have a look at the chat later, but some very interesting responses as well when you raise the Teletubbies example, some other examples of children's TV and film characters where their language is perhaps minimal or non-existent in the traditional sense, but it's all about the rhythm and the musicality. Vineet Lal responded with the clangers, which is
Yes,
of course
I thought
another
the clangers as well.
another
Yeah.
classic. I was thinking about Pingu. And then Joe Heinrich said, what about Pingu? And Maren Bode-Lackner as well suggested the Minions.
Bill and Ben.
So there are,
Yeah.
you're definitely onto something there. There are a number of examples there. With your example from of the Arrival, the film, and you were suggesting musical How to Contact Aliens. I was thinking actually in the news this week has been the Voyager 1 space probe, hasn't which
Yeah.
which was sent into kind of the outer reaches with recordings of speech, but also of singing and different kinds of music. I was thinking about Close Encounters of the Third Kind as well, where they try and reach out to aliens with just with music, don't they? So it's a really it's such a rich area. Thank you so much, Kari, for introducing us to all these fascinating ideas and examples. And so I mentioned things in the chat, and do please speaking to our audience now, do please put your questions in the Q&A field. I'm sure there are plenty of questions one or two comments in the chat, which I think could as well be questions. So do perhaps transfer them to the Q&A. I wonder, Kari, if I could just start with a question to you about whether by now, perhaps this is too kind of early, but whether you're able to kind of boil this down to a prescription for the translator, thinking about, you know,
That's the dream.
translating rhythm, translating musicality. Do you have a sense yet of how best to capture this, or are you thinking that perhaps with your workshop you'll develop some techniques for kind of bringing out
I mean,
these aspects?
ideally, what I'd like to do is create a kind of blueprint that anyone can use for a workshop.
Mm.
And like the idea with the Gruffalo was just one that I had because I knew the Gruffalo had been translated into multiple languages and it has such an obvious rhyme. So it makes it quite, as a first shot at it, it makes it quite easy. My own ineptitude, I realize I need to use scansion more. I need to learn about prosody. I need to have any really meaningful answer to that question. I need to learn a lot more. I'm also fascinated by this idea that we're all slightly different, so we will all hear slightly different things. Based on our physical physiognomy and how we're put together, but also our experience. So I don't know. I think we can probably get a ballpark or a playground which has some games on it that we can use to play around with. But I think a lot of it will always come down to what sits with you as the translator. And this idea that we're not listening to the voice of the author at all. We're listening to our own voice.
Yes. Because I was
Reading the author.
Thinking about musicality. I mean, it's often said, oh, well, you know, some people are more musical than others. But you're suggesting, are you that actually when it comes to translating the musicality of text, then all translators can and perhaps should pick up on these features.
Well, I think
some will be better at it than others, perhaps.
Yeah.
Some will be more adept at translating aspects of poetry than others, perhaps. But it seems to me that you're kind of the bigger picture that you're presenting is that these features, which one might want to think of as, oh, typical of poetry, are actually typical of any kind of text that you're translating.
It's how we speak, how we use our language, how we put things together. And like Andy said, you know, that is part of language acquisition. That poem of that rhyme that I gave that my uncle used, it's about intonation, it's about vocalization, it's about rhythm, it's about this idea that I really don't know what English sounds like. I don't know what our rhythms are because maybe because I've never formally studied it. And I know about these words like scansion, prosody, but I don't know them well enough to really explain what I'm trying to do. And so one of the reasons I chose music was because it would be, for want of a better word, how we use these words flying around. It would be a visible presentation, obviously not an auditory presentation, of where there is coincidence of rhythm and where there isn't. And I guess now I'm exploring the gap in between and why that happened. And there will be things like syllable uses, this thing like words. So, for example, the word spennende in Norwegian incorporates tension, nervousness, anticipation, excitement. And in English, we have to choose. So people always say, oh, but English is such a rich language. Yes, it is. We have lots of words, but sometimes I miss those words that span. And we have to, and even the sound of spennende has some of that tension in it. Whereas excitement really doesn't, to me, when I hear it as a sound. Again, that that's me subjectively. I don't know if people agree with that or not. I think there is a kind of, there is a level where we agree on things, which I'm guessing comes from the patterns that we learn as children. Yeah.
Thank you, Kari. So some responses and questions have started to come in. Thank you to our audience for those. Do keep them coming. Christina McSweeney, hello, Christina.
Hi, Christina.
Says not a question, but it would be interesting to think how onomatopoeia fits into this. Spanish uses it in a different way to English.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm sure. And I was fascinated by the fact that just listening to the shape of what the Spanish girl read, I was like, gosh, where's the rhythm? Where's the rhyme? And I said, does this rhyme? And she went, yes, kind of. So for her, she could hear the rhyme. I couldn't hear it at all. So I think an onomatopoeia is different, and how and also alliteration and things like that. What happens when you can see that alliteration is really clear in one text, and you have to change it into another set of letters in another language. And yes, what does, well, animal sounds are a very good game to play as well. In terms of that, you know, does a cockerel say cock-a-doodle-doo, or does it say kickily-coo? And where do they get any of them from anyway? Because most of them sound bonkers.
Christina has another thought, which is this. I find all this about listening fascinating and agree with most of what you say, but it would be interesting to know what Jeffrey Zuckerman would say as a deaf translator.
Yes. And that, thank you, Christina. When I started writing this, I suddenly became really aware that I couldn't, because I am hearing, I take it for granted, but it was not something that I could assume. I know when I worked in theatre in London, I was actually, funnily enough, one of the first people to organise signed performances. And one of the signers that we used at the time was someone called Ben Steiner, who was hearing but had grown up with deaf parents, so that the first language his mother tongue was sign language. And he talks about there being a spatial grammar. So I can't give you any more clues than that, but that they do hear there is a rhythm and there is an inherent rhythm, but how it works, I don't know. I think we would need to ask a signer or a deaf person to explain that, because but the notion of a spatial grammar I find fascinating. He said, in sign language, I can get you to the room in the house that you want to get to faster than explaining it in English. So.
Thank you. I mentioned Maren Bordelakna before. Maren says, not a question, but in response to the question, what does English sound like to outsiders? French people tend to really like an exaggerated, ooh, yeah, to mimic English.
All right.
Here we go. So then, but Maren also has a question. As a translator and musician myself, I've always considered the two to be related.
Yeah.
I wonder how many translators are also musicians, actually. Is the percentage higher than the general public? I was also wondering that when you said, you said, oh, sadly, I'm not a musician, you said.
I'm not a musician.
Because I was wondering whether you also play an instrument, presumably not then, but...
Oh, way back, I played the piano and the flute very badly. I love music. I listen to a lot of music. My mother was a keen audience goer and piano player, so I have a lot of music in my life, but I wouldn't call myself a musician.
What do you think about Maren's question then? Do you think this musicality is kind of more prevalent among...
I'll tell you another. I don't know is the answer, but I'm going to go away and find out. And if people are musicians who are listening, pop it in the box, and then we can find out on a catchphrase here. But a very interesting thing is that I'm also a flamenco dancer. And at the time, there is a surprising amount of people who dance in my flamenco classes who are translators and language learners.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, but from another angle, if that makes sense. That's a real snapshot and a very arbitrary example, but fascinating. And I always said there's something in this. Why are there so many translators who are doing flamenco?
A nice short question from Silvina Katz, who asks, have you explored the notion of listening with the body? Following on from your dance example.
I'm not entirely sure what you mean by that, but I quite like the idea. You can play, I know the idea of playing rhythms on your body. And the bird workshop that I talked about, I don't know if this is going to answer your question at all, was with
Was Sasha
Sasha
Dugdale?
Dugdale.
Yes.
And she sent us all off to interpret a bird song in any way we wished. So some people wrote poems, other people sang, and my particular group did modern dance improvisation of a kookaburra laughing, which I guess you could say is listening with your body. I'm not entirely sure, but there you go. I hope that answers Sylvie.
Thank you. Vineet Lal, I mentioned earlier as well, and Vineet has been very active in the chat and also has a question. Even if we as a translation community don't know precisely what the mechanics of musicality are, there must be some innate sense of the rhythm of our target languages that makes us as translators decide to add or subtract a word or syllables in order to make the text sound right. I've often found myself doing precisely that, adding in an extraneous word in order to make the sentence land where I want it to, but there's no conscious process underpinning those decisions. Says
I totally agree. And authors will go, oh, why is that word there? I didn't write that. Particularly when you translate into English and they think that, and you go, oh, because it sounds better. And I think this is to do with isochrony, or isochrony is also disputed as a term. And but it's something to do with this, where the stresses are and where this and how we present language. And I need to go away. Vineet, we can meet and have coffee and we can discuss it and we can go to classes and study together. Because I don't know the answer, if I'm going to be honest. And it's something that fascinates me. And that's one of the things that I want to learn is that I can answer these things when I'm asked questions and I go, just because it sounds nicer. Yeah.
I was thinking, actually, there's a comment in the chat from Sue Proof on the question of what other languages sound like to non-speakers of that language. On the one hand, Welsh is described as being harsh with no vowels, all ch sounds, and on the other hand, as being so musical, so beautiful, so lyrical, suggesting that these judgments are perhaps very subjective. But I was thinking, as well, as you were speaking, with your thinking about the common perceptions of languages as being more musical than others. Oh, Italian, of course, is so musical, and yet so often when you listen to, I don't know, I listened to an opera in Hungarian, thinking of Bartok, Bluebeard's Castle or something. I'm thinking, gosh, what a wonderfully musical language, and I wouldn't have suspected that at all, perhaps otherwise. I think these are very subjective judgments, but I'm wondering if there are more objective.
This is Your Brain on Music, by Levitine, Understanding a Human Obsession. He's very good because he does break down what we mean when we talk about timbre, tone, duration for music, but I think equally they can be applied to language. And he talks a lot about language and resonance as well, and where it resonates in your body and what your ears do when you're listening. So again, you know, 2 months in, I don't feel I've got enough knowledge to answer any of this, which was why I felt a bit like the emperor's new clothes. But I think that I'm sure there are ways to do this, and I very definitely want to continue this. I'm not quite sure how, and I know that Hafter is keen to do it. And I was thinking that the poem that I used by Agnes Torok, she is Swedish, English bilingual, lives just outside Edinburgh, and has partners who are from. She's had partners who speak different languages, and she talks in this life and love or death by bilingualism. She talks about someone called Dr. Thomas Bach, who is real, and he is a neurolinguistic. He works in psychology. He is a neurolinguist. He specializes in bilingualism. He's a polyglot, and he also happened to learn Norwegian from me. So I'm going to get in touch with him and try and work out if there is any way, and see if he has any sort of data sets and things that I can use, or ideas about how I can go about discovering the answer, more answers to some of these questions.
A number of comments in the chat actually about this question of music and the body. Brett says, my PhD looks at how the body is used to translate for opera. And
wow.
Nari Youssef likes this question very much, and has also been thinking a lot about where translation happens in the body. Yes, Brett, again, corporeality is incredibly important in the translation of opera and in finding singability.
Yeah.
I was wondering so in your presentation, you're focusing on the differences between languages and the different kinds of rhythm and different kinds of musicality in different languages. I'm wondering then, for the translator, going back to my earlier question about, well, what does the translator take away from your presentation? Are you suggesting that it's kind of it's incumbent on the translator to try and translate that that rhythm and try and convey that rhythm and that musicality of the source language somehow in their translation as well, or to find out, would you want to reach for the notion of equivalence and finding some sort of
I think it's more equivalence. I mean, because I think I do. This is one of the bits I do remember of translation theory is Morris, of, I can't remember his first name, of the wallpaper.
William.
William Morris was also a keen translator of Scandinavian sagas. And his idea was to make things as foreign as possible, because we were reading foreign works. So, you know, don't pander to the English ear, you know, make sure they know that they're reading something foreign.
Do you do that in your own translation work?
No, I will always, no. But it's an interesting exercise. I will always go, because they're also hopefully going to be sold and read by people. I don't go all the way. I don't, you know, domesticize texts. I don't do anything like that. But I do make them what I think is comfortable to read. Even if they're very long sentences, even if the style is I guess what I do is I try to maintain the style of the writer as much as possible, but make it as easy to read as possible for an English reader. How successful I am in that journey, who knows? You know, that people will have, it's so subjective. People will like it or not like it. You know, it's kind of, so I'm not advocating that we need to, but I think as an exercise is interesting. And I think it's a way of training our listening, and also being more aware of what it is that we're talking about when we talk about music in text. Because sometimes when I talk to people who are not translators, they get very perplexed and they don't understand when you talk about the rhythm of a text. You know, they won't. So it was a kind of, it all started with a, like I said, I thought it was a simple, neat idea of how to demonstrate what we do. And it just gets more and more complex.
Isn't that the way with simple ideas? They turn out to be much less simple than perhaps they seemed at first. We've been talking so far mainly about European languages, and there's a question from Midori Takahashi who says, "Thank you so
Mara.
much. Thank you for very much. What do you think about the musicality of Asian languages? For example, Midori continues, I'm a speaker of Japanese, which is based on more rather than on syllables, and which is quantitative rather than accentual. How do you think the musicality of haiku 575 and tanka 57577 can be reflected in English translation?"
That's why I didn't talk about it. I am aware of this, Mara, timed, and because I just have to excuse me, I have very limited knowledge of Asian languages. I do hang out quite a lot with Japanese people, so I'm used to hearing it. And I would recognize it as a sound, but I don't know that I've ever consciously listened to it to pick out what I'm doing with European languages. And it would be very interesting to work with people who have languages that I have no idea about, which is what we're going to, this idea in the workshop on the 15th, to use well, I don't know who's going to be coming to that workshop other than this year's cohort of master's students. So I know what languages the master's students speak, and if there are people there who understand the language that's going to be spoken, I will ask them to keep it quiet for a while. So it is that idea of being presented with something that is utterly unfamiliar. What do we hear? What do we pick out? What are the similarities? And I guess you always look at what are the similarities, which is this idea of connection.
Thank you. A question from Marion Fairweather in the chat. I believe that the sound of a person's language is very important to them, that it's a kind of music to them. Do you, Kari, add or omit a lot in your translations from Norwegian into English to make it sound as musical as it does in Norwegian to English speakers?
Generally, I add in English. So English translations are often about 10% longer than Norwegian. Partly, I think partly because of this thing where they have words that are not compounds, because that's the wrong word, but words that have multiple meanings. So that there's a wonderful nuancing of what your understanding is, whereas in English we have to choose a specific. We're much more specific in our word choice. I'm fudging an answer here, haven't I? I think, as I said earlier, I try to make it as readable or as enjoyable, as comfortable for the reader as possible. Not enjoyable because some things aren't comfortable. But if it's obvious in the Norwegian that it's meant to be uncomfortable, I will make it uncomfortable I will try to make it uncomfortable in the English. If it's just running text, I will try to make it as comfortable, the wrong word again, but as easy for the reader to read without stumbling or thinking, oh, this is a translation. Maybe that's what we've grown up with here. And originally, I can remember, translation was a dirty word for a long time. You don't let on it's a translation because people won't read it. Not because I don't think that they were scared, but then it wasn't authentic in some way. It wasn't, it wasn't the real experience. didn't encourage anyone to go off and learn languages, but well, some people it did. Some people it did, but we come from a country where sadly people are very shy of foreign languages and things that are foreign. So have I answered? Where it feels appropriate, yes.
A comment from Sue Proof in the chat. You'd be interested in poetry written in Cynhadledd, Welsh strict meter poetry forms. I can send an explanation in English with English language examples if you like, says Sue. So do download the chat at the end. And Sue's given her her email address there.
Someone might need to show me how to download the chat. Poetry terrifies me, as many of you will know. So yeah, perhaps for this very reason, maybe now is my time. Maybe now is the time to go off and learn about meter more.
There's some there's a debate brewing in the chat as well around foreignization. Vineet suggesting there's always the perennial risk that if a literary translator deliberately makes something sound foreign or strange, they leave themselves open to criticism, i.e. not a fluent translation. I guess we as a community err towards fluency in order to self-protect. David Colmer, isn't the foreignness that an outsider sees quite superficial? Instead, I strive to reproduce the effect the original has on readers of the original language. But your presentation, Kari, has raised a lot of issues. I can see that they're burgeoning in the chat as well. Let me put a different question to you from Anna Sophia. Anna Sophia says, I'm looking at the difference between translating audiobooks versus written books and how that affects the translation, especially into Norwegian, as that is the language I focus on.
Right.
And Anna Sophia says, do you have any advice or notes?
No, but I do think this thing that if it is for audiobooks and if it's about speakability, I would say go and look at theatre translation. Or do theatre translation workshops, because I think that this is a relatively new thought to me, and it, because it hadn't occurred to me that someone might write for audio. Apparently radio plays are becoming hugely popular again. So I think it is something. Yeah, you then also have to think about the speakability of something. So sentences will need to be possibly restructured, broken down. Punctuation will be more important to enable the person reading it to read it smoothly. You heard how I stuttered when I was reading my own text.
I was wondering about translation readings then. I mean, I love the emphasis in your presentation on performance and on translation. On the this is early on in your presentation. You're talking about improvisation,
Yeah.
and about sort of translation as performance. And that set me thinking whether you would argue that actually then it's best if say a trained actor reads a translation in order they would perhaps stand a better chance of getting across these aspects that you're interested in, rhythm and musicality. Or would you say that actually no, it's the translator who is most attuned?
Well, ultimately it's the reader. I mean, it's the reader who's reading it in their head. So if we're performing it, the translator will be closest to it and will be closest to the rhythms and the sounds that they have chosen. But I think also that if you, and again, my knowledge of this is limited to Norway, and Anna Sophia, you can agree with me of this if you or disagree with me, but already between Norwegian and English, I can see that, especially in poetry, there's very different styles of reading out loud. So where the pauses are, how people present themselves, the kind of voice they use, which I guess is different from theatre, where it changes a lot all the time, and there's interaction between characters, and there's dialogue. With audio, it has to be something that someone will be able to read over a sustained period of time, because some of these big books can take 18 days to record. So you're sitting reading for, long periods of time. It's not necessarily, I suppose you can practice reading, but you can't practice reading the whole book. You have to be a practice reader, in which case actors are perhaps better. But actors actually don't read from scripts either. They learn their lines when they're on stage. So it is, I think we can all train ourselves to be good readers and to be able to read out loud. And it's also that for me, it's very much about speed. I know I have to slow down a lot. But there are different styles of reading, and I don't know if that's according to cultural conventions and national cultural conventions, or if that is, yeah.
You're reminding me actually of my previous university some moons ago at Swansea University. They had, and as I believe still have, a recording centre for the blind. And I used to record, I'd read German language books onto tape back in those days for blind readers. And it was a great discipline and a great education in the importance of getting it right. And so I was wondering, it's often said, isn't it, that translators are the best readers of literary works, and I wonder if you would argue that translators are kind of most attuned then to these features that you're interested in, that as part of that skill set, that translators are best attuned.
Possibly. I mean, a lot of the authors that I've worked with say, no one reads it as well as a translator, because we're asking questions. And this kind of like this idea that, are we simultaneous? The first time we read a book and we know we're going to translate it, are we already working on what's happening with the sound, the rhythm? Oh, I need to remember that bit. That's going to be difficult. This is going to be that. So we have chosen to be active readers, active listeners. And while we may not have done it initially, I'm sure that everyone will become more aware of it now when they go away and start to read it. What we're doing. But I think it's something we've become more and more aware of. And that is why, why I've launched off into this, what I'm doing. Yes, possibly we are. But just because we're the best readers of a text doesn't mean to say that we're the best speakers of a text. And Nari and I were talking yesterday or this morning about how ironic it is that the development in the literary market of book festivals and literary festivals and the increased visibility of translators means that people who, this doesn't apply to everyone, but often people will go to things like translation because we can be on our own and quiet, and we're suddenly asked to present things and to read and to be out loud. But I do think it is interesting, and what I find interesting is that people who have no idea of what we do are fascinated when you start asking questions. And I think that is one reason why there are more and more translation events. I think they've just never thought about it before. And I like to think that people are naturally curious.
Talking of naturally curious, there's a nice comment from Rebecca DeWald in the chat. Hello, Rebecca. Rebecca says, Kari, you're welcome to hang out with my 4-month-old as he starts babbling and copying what he must think English sounds like.
But also English and German. So you could, can he differentiate? You need to do that test on him and see if he can differentiate between stress-timed and syllable-timed. I find that fascinating.
I mean, it is. I'm trying to remember the research here, but it is. I mean, what you've been speaking about is an aspect that is picked up in child language acquisition very early, isn't it?
Yeah.
These differences, as I understand it.
Infants so I'm guessing babies. So Rebecca, Daniel can become a not an experiment, but yeah, specimen for us.
We've a question from Paris, Jean-Cher Litvak. Hello, Paris. In French, Paris says there's a huge tradition of setting poetry to music. Is this also the case for Norwegian? I'm very interested in poetry's influence on pop culture.
I don't, I say this a lot. I'm not sure, to be honest. I think it happens, and I think the way they have a very sonorous way of reading of reciting poetry often. I don't know if Anna Sophia, I don't know if I know your name, so I can say, would you say, as Norwegian, she would say yes. There you go. So I think they are, poetry is often performed at gigs in music venues. So yeah, there is an alignment there. And just recently I went to see Alan Cooper playing here, and he had poetry in his set. And I guess, I mean, if you look at pop music, lyrics are poetry. You know, it's more than running text.
I think yes. I wonder if Paris is thinking about kind of the sort of the chanson tradition in French, and the emphasis on the lyrics perhaps being greater in French language popular music than English language. Perhaps I don't know.
Yes.
There was a comment during your talk from Martin Cassel, which I don't know, Martin, if you're still there, if you would like to formulate that as a question, because I'm not sure what that related to now. But we might perhaps have time for one last question. But Kari will need to let you go shortly, because you've been so generous with your time in answering our questions as well. There, I don't think there are any more in the Q&A here. And Anna Sophia had a comment about dialect and about the importance of dialect within Norwegian, and I suppose that's another aspect of the differences, not just between languages, but within languages.
But also, Norwegian has this really unique, I don't know if it's unique. No, Norwegian has two standard languages, two official standard languages, which are both Norwegian, but they behave slightly differently grammatically. And if you, in fact, language in Norway is very political. And if you write in Nynorsk, you automatically, New Norwegian, the market is slightly smaller. So I've asked Nynorsk writers, why, do you choose to write in Nynorsk for political reasons, or it's the language that they feel most comfortable with generally, and it's used mainly on the dialects that are spoken. It's not this is, I'm going into Norwegian language thing, but it's the dialects that are spoken on the west coast mainly, that are closest to Nynorsk. But it's actually not a spoken language. People speak their dialect and they write, it's a written standard. And there's the only two places where pure Nynorsk is spoken really is on the television and in the theatre. I see the rap Gil Scott Heron. Nikki introduced me to the Adriana Celentano piece as part of her work into rap and slang. So she'd obviously got it way back then, because he's chatting the lines. Sorry, that was a very digressive answer to.
That's quite all right. I think we are out of time now, but thank you all. Thank
for
you.
making it easy and enjoyable.
Well, it was certainly that. Thank you to all of our audience for your interactions of all kinds. Plenty of comments, as I say, in the chat, which I haven't had time to read out. But thank you for all your questions. Do join us again in a couple of weeks' time. As I mentioned, our other current translator in residence, Nariman Youssef, will be presenting then. But for the moment, Kari, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing your project with us and for a really fascinating presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And thank you. I recommend the residency to everyone.